The sun hung low over the dry, cracked earth of northeastern Nigeria, baking everything under a heavy blanket of heat. Dust swirled in lazy circles, kicked up by the occasional breeze that offered no real relief. In a dimly lit safe house on the edge of a half-abandoned town, a group of men and women sat around a folding table, their faces tired but alert. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, not anymore. They were contractors, hired guns with military pasts, now working for private companies that paid well and asked few questions. Their latest job had come through a middleman who spoke in riddles and paid half up front in untraceable crypto. The mission sounded simple enough. Escort a convoy of food, medicine, and supplies through a stretch of land that had been unstable for years. Bandits, rogue militias, and splinter groups from old terrorist networks still roamed the area, but this team had handled worse. They'd been in places where the rules didn't apply and survival meant trusting your instincts more than your orders. But something about this contract felt off. For one, the client insisted they avoid night travel, no exceptions. That was unusual. Most convoys moved at night to avoid daytime heat and visibility. Then there was the map they'd been given. One small cluster of villages near the route was marked with a thick red circle labeled only as Zone Theta. No explanation. Just a warning. Do not enter. Do not approach. If diverted, reroute immediately. The team leader, a quiet man with deep lines around his eyes from years of squinting into sun and smoke, studied the map longer than the others. He'd seen enough war zones to know that when someone went out of their way to hide something, it wasn't because it was boring. Later that evening, while checking gear, one of the locals, a wiry man who'd been guiding foreign crews for years, leaned in close. "You stay away from that place," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "People go in. They don't come out." One of the younger team members chuckled. "Ghosts again? We've heard that one before." The guide didn't smile. "They look like men, walk like men, but they don't move like men. And they don't leave bodies just gone." The laughter died quickly, not because they believed in spirits, but because in places like this the real horrors were always human. That night, 2 small reconnaissance drones were sent up to scan Zone Theta from a safe distance. The team watched the live feed on a tablet. Empty huts, broken fences, dry riverbeds. Nothing moved. Then, without warning, both screens went black. No signal loss, no interference spike, just sudden total silence. Attempts to reconnect failed. The drones were gone. No one said it out loud, but a quiet tension settled over the group. These were professionals trained to stay calm under fire, to assess threats logically. Yet for the first time in a long time, they felt uneasy in a way that didn't make sense. There was no enemy sighted, no ambush sprung, no gunfire, just silence, and something watching from the shadows. The next morning, as they prepped the vehicles, the team leader double-checked the route. He made sure it curved wide around Zone Theta, adding extra miles but keeping them clear of the red circle. One of his people asked if he really believed the local stories. "I don't believe in ghosts," he replied, tightening a strap on his pack. "But I believe in things I don't understand. And in this part of the world, not understanding can get you killed faster than bullets." They rolled out at dawn, engines rumbling through the stillness. The landscape stretched endlessly, flat, brown, and unforgiving. For hours, nothing happened. Just the hum of diesel engines, the crunch of tires on gravel, and the occasional radio check-in. It almost felt peaceful. Almost. Then near midday, they hit a problem. A key bridge on their planned route had been blown. Recently. Fresh scorch marks, twisted metal still warm to the touch. No signs of a fight, no bodies, no shell casings. Just destruction, clean and precise. The only detour led them closer to the edge of Zone Theta than anyone wanted. After a tense debate, they agreed to take the alternate path, but with extra caution. Drones went up again, sensors were activated, and 2 scouts moved ahead on foot. The sun beat down harder now and the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. As they neared a dried-up riverbed that cut through the land like a scar, someone spotted movement on a distant ridge. Figures, standing, not running, not hiding, just standing there silhouetted against the pale sky. No weapons visible, no uniforms, just stillness. "Could be locals," someone muttered. "Locals don't stand like statues in 45-degree heat," came the reply. A drone was launched for a closer look. It hovered closer, camera zooming in. The figures didn't react. Then in less than 3 seconds they vanished. Not by running behind cover. There was none for hundreds of meters. One moment they were there. The next, the ridge was empty. The drone kept scanning, circling the area. Nothing. No footprints kicked up. No dust trails. It was as if they'd never been there at all. Back at the convoy, unease turned into something sharper. The team leader called for a halt. We're not going another meter until we know what we're dealing with. That night, they set up a tight perimeter. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, rotating watch shifts. Everyone slept with a weapon within arm's reach. But despite all the tech and training, nothing could explain what happened next. 2 team members woke just before sunrise to find their rifles, normally kept inside their tents for quick access, stacked neatly outside, barrels pointed away from camp. The weapons had been taken apart, cleaned, reassembled, and reloaded. Every round accounted for. Not a scratch out of place, no alarms had gone off. No guards had seen anyone approach. The ground around the tents showed no footprints, not even animal tracks. One of the veterans, a woman who'd served in 3 different war zones, stared at her rifle like it was a stranger. "This isn't a warning," she said quietly. "This is a message," the team gathered in hushed tones. Some wanted to push forward. Others argued for calling off the mission entirely. The team leader looked out toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn painted the land in soft gold. He thought about the local guide's words, might they look like men, but they don't move like men. Maybe they weren't dealing with bandits or insurgents. Maybe they were dealing with something far more unsettling. People who had learned to disappear not through magic, but through pain, discipline, and a kind of silence that war had carved into their bones. And for the first time, these hardened mercenaries, men and women who'd faced death head-on, felt something they rarely admitted: fear. Not of being killed, but of not understanding what was hunting them, or why it hadn't killed them yet. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Time stretched like old rubber, slow and sticky. The team kept moving, but their eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Every shadow, every gust of wind, every distant bird taking flight sent a ripple of tension through them. They weren't used to feeling watched without seeing who was watching. 3 days into the mission, their main route was blocked again, this time by a landslide caused by controlled explosives. It wasn't random. Someone had planned it. With no other choice, they took a narrow path through a dried riverbed, the kind of place vehicles weren't meant to go. Rocks scraped under tires, and dust coated everything: their clothes, their gear, even the inside of their mouths. It was late afternoon when they saw them. On a far ridge, maybe half a kilometer away, stood 5 figures. They wore torn civilian clothes, faded shirts, loose trousers, some barefoot. No weapons in sight. They just stood there perfectly still, facing the convoy, not threatening, not running, just watching. One of the team members raised his rifle instinctively, but the team leader held up a hand. "Hold fire. They're not doing anything." Still, something about the way they stood, spines straight, arms at their sides, heads slightly tilted, felt unnatural, like mannequins placed there on purpose. A drone was sent up quietly, its whir barely audible over the wind. The camera zoomed in. Their faces were gaunt, eyes wide but unblinking, skin dry from the sun, no movement at all. Then, in less than the time it takes to blink, they were gone. Not running, not ducking. One frame they were there. The next, the ridge was empty. The drone circled lower, scanning the ground, the rocks, the brush. Nothing. No dust kicked up. No trail. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Back at the vehicles, silence hung heavy. No one joked. No one even cursed. They just packed up the drone and moved on. But the mood had shifted. This wasn't guerrilla tactics. This was something else. That night, they set up camp in a shallow dip between 2 rocky outcrops, a defensible spot with clear sight lines. Sensors were placed every 20 meters. Infrared tripwires, motion detectors. 2 people on watch at all times, rotating every 2 hours. They even strung thin fishing line between bushes, old school but effective. If anyone crept close, they'd hear it snap, but nothing triggered. Yet just before dawn, 2 team members woke to a strange sound, the soft click of metal on metal. They sat up fast, hearts pounding. Outside their tent, their rifles lay side by side on a flat rock, barrels pointed away from camp. Not stolen, not damaged, but taken apart, cleaned, oiled, and reassembled with care. Even the magazines had been reloaded, fresh rounds seated perfectly, no footprints, no broken twine, no alarm. One of them picked up his rifle slowly, running his fingers over the bolt. It was cleaner than it had been in months. Whoever did this, he said, voice low, knew exactly what they were doing. Knew our gear, knew our routines. The team gathered in the gray light of early morning, faces tight with confusion and something deeper, doubt. These weren't amateurs, and they weren't trying to kill. If they wanted to, they could have slit throats in the night, but instead they returned weapons. Polished them even. Then the comms started acting up. At first it was just static, annoying but normal in remote areas. But soon voices began cutting through the noise. Not enemy chatter, not coded messages. Familiar voices. A child calling Dad, a woman humming a lullaby someone's sister used to sing. One man swore he heard his mother's voice saying, "Come home." They shut the radios off, but the sounds didn't stop. It was like the air itself was whispering. Some blamed it on interference from old cell towers or military jamming. But the nausea that followed, the dizziness, the cold sweat, felt too real to be just radio waves. It was as if the sound was crawling inside their heads, stirring up memories they'd buried deep. Sleep became impossible. When they did doze off, dreams were sharp and vivid. Faces of people they'd lost, places they'd sworn never to return to. One man woke shouting, convinced someone had been standing over him just breathing. Another kept checking his boots, sure someone had moved them while he slept. The team leader called a meeting under the midday sun, hoping the heat would burn away the fog in their minds. "We're being played," he said. "Not attacked, played, they're getting inside our heads." "But why?" Someone asked. "What do they want?" No one had an answer. But the fear wasn't just about danger anymore. It was about losing control of their senses, their thoughts, their trust in what was real. Later that day, they met a group of villagers walking toward a nearby settlement. The team leader approached carefully, offering water and medicine. In broken but clear English, an older man with tired eyes warned them again. "Don't go near the quiet villages, the ones with no smoke from chimneys, no dogs barking. Those places, they belong to the still ones." "The still ones?" the team leader asked. The man nodded. "They were children once, taken by fighters, trained in silence. They don't speak. They don't blink much. They move like shadows. Some say they can hold their breath for minutes. Others say they sleep standing up. We don't know. But we know this, they don't hurt the innocent. Only those who bring violence." One of the team members scoffed. "So there's some kind of ghost army?" The old man looked him in the eye. "They're not ghosts. They're what's left when war takes everything but the will to protect." That night the hum returned, low, deep, vibrating in the chest. It wasn't loud, but it made teeth ache and thoughts scatter. Two team members vomited. Another sat with his head in his hands, rocking slightly. The team leader stayed awake, staring into the dark, listening. And then, just before sunrise, he saw it. A figure crouched low near the edge of camp, no more than 30 meters away. Not hiding, not attacking, just watching, its head tilted slightly like an animal listening. Then, as if sensing he'd been seen, it melted backward into the brush, so smoothly, so silently, that if the team leader hadn't been looking right at that spot, he would have missed it entirely. He didn't raise the alarm, didn't call for weapons. He just sat there, heart pounding, realizing something terrifying. These people weren't monsters. They were survivors, and they were better at this than any soldier he'd ever met. The real question wasn't how to fight them. It was why they were being warned off, instead of wiped out, and that thought kept him awake longer than any ghost story ever could. The tension in the camp had turned into something heavier, something that clung to the skin like damp cloth. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Every rustle of wind, every creak of gear sent hands reaching for weapons that now felt more like comfort objects than tools of defense. The team had faced ambushes, firefights, even betrayal, but this was different. It wasn't just fear of being attacked. It was the slow unraveling of certainty. What was real? What was imagined? And who were these people who moved like ghosts but left no graves? One morning, after another night of whispers in the static and dreams that felt too sharp to be dreams, the team leader made a decision. He needed answers. Not from radios or drones, but from people who'd lived here long before contractors showed up with armored trucks and satellite maps. He pulled aside the local guide they'd been working with since arrival, a man who knew every dry well and hidden path in the region. Over bitter tea brewed on a small stove, the guide finally opened up. He spoke slowly, choosing words like stones, careful, deliberate. Years ago, he began, when the big fighting was worse, children were taken. Not just boys. Girls too. Some were 8, 9 years old. They were trained in camps deep in the bush, no talking, no crying, no names. Only silence. Only obedience, he paused, eyes distant. But something changed. A group broke away, not to join another side, to disappear. They took the youngest ones, the ones who hadn't been twisted yet, and vanished into the empty villages. No one saw them for months, then strange things started happening. Patrols that came too close would find their weapons gone. Radios dead, tents undisturbed, but everyone inside, awake, shaken but alive. Why not just kill them? Someone asked, voice rough from lack of sleep. The guide shook his head, because killing makes more war. They wanted peace, not revenge. Later that day, luck, or maybe fate, gave them a break. A man stumbled into their perimeter just after dusk, half dead from thirst, ribs showing through his shirt. He wasn't armed, just a ragged coat and eyes full of fear. At first, they thought it was a trap. But when they offered water, he drank like a man who hadn't seen rain in weeks. Under guard, he told his story in broken phrases, switching between local dialects and rough English. He'd once fought with one of the militant groups, but deserted after seeing what they did to villages. I tried to warn them, he whispered, hands trembling around a cup of broth. But they sent the still ones after me. The still ones? The team leader asked. The man nodded fast. Not ghosts. Not spirits. Men and women, but changed. They don't blink much. Move like snakes in tall grass, no sound. They watch for days before they act. I saw them once, crawling on their bellies for hours just to stay downwind, like animals but smarter. He described how they'd infiltrated his old camp not to kill but to sabotage. They'd poured sand into fuel tanks, cut brake lines, hidden trackers and supply crates, all without a single shot fired. They don't want us here, he said, but they don't want blood either. They protect the villages, the children, the old people. Then he dropped his voice even lower. They left messages, drawings on walls, symbols. One showed faceless figures standing between soldiers and a school. Another showed hands holding water, not guns. The team sat in silence after he finished. No one mocked him. No one called it fantasy, because it matched what they'd seen. The returned rifles, the vanished figures, the warnings without violence. Back in their makeshift command tent, the team leader spread out everything they had. Drone footage before it cut out. Sensor logs, sketches from the defector, notes from villagers. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. Not of monsters, but of survivors who'd turned trauma into a strange kind of discipline. Isolation, sensory control. Movement so slow and precise it defied normal human limits. They weren't supernatural. They were human, but pushed so far beyond normal experience that they'd learned to operate outside it. One of the veterans, a woman who'd worked in psychological operations before going private, leaned over the table. This isn't just stealth, she said. It's psychological deterrence. They're not trying to win a fight. They're trying to prevent one by making us doubt everything, our senses, our safety, even our mission. That explained the voices on the radio, the hum that made people sick. The way they'd mimic loved ones' voices, not to deceive, but to remind these hardened fighters of what they'd left behind, of what they were risking by being here. The team leader thought about the convoy they were supposed to be protecting. Humanitarian aid, yes, but who was really paying for it? Who stood to gain if this route stayed open? He'd never asked before. Contractors weren't paid to ask. But now the question burned in his chest. What if their presence, armed, foreign, suspicious, was seen as a threat by the very people they were supposedly helping? What if the still ones weren't the enemy, but the last line of defense for those who couldn't defend themselves? That night, instead of setting up the usual perimeter, the team did something unusual. They left a small offering near the edge of camp, a crate of clean water, medical supplies, and a note written in simple local script. We mean no harm to the innocent. No one saw anyone take it. But by morning, the crate was gone. In its place, a single smooth stone rested on the ground, unmarked, cool to the touch. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a surrender. It was an acknowledgement. And for the first time since arriving, the team felt something other than fear. They felt seen, not as soldiers, not as invaders, but as humans, flawed, confused, but still capable of choice. The hum didn't return that night. The dreams were quieter, and when the sun rose, the air felt lighter, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. Against every rule in the contract, against every instinct trained into him over decades of discipline, the team leader made a choice. He wasn't going to wait for answers anymore. He was going to walk into the silence and see what was really there. He took only 2 others with him, people he trusted not just with his life, but with their own judgment. No heavy gear, no radios that could be jammed or mimicked, just sidearms, water, and a small pack with basic medical supplies. They left at first light, moving on foot through the cracked earth and dry brush, keeping low, moving slow, not like soldiers on patrol, but like people who didn't want to be seen. The journey to Zone Theta took most of the day. The landscape grew quieter the closer they got. No birds, no insects, just the wind sighing through broken walls. The villages ahead looked like skeletons of what they once were. Collapsed roofs, doors hanging off rusted hinges, walls pockmarked with old bullet holes. But something felt different here. Not abandoned, just waiting. They entered the largest building, a schoolhouse, its chalkboard still faintly marked with half-erased lessons in math and local language. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust floated in sunbeams that cut through holes in the roof. At first glance, it seemed empty. But then one of them noticed the murals. On the far wall, painted in faded colors, were figures. Faceless, yes, but standing in a line, arms outstretched, shielding a group of children drawn in bright red and yellow. Another showed the same figures pulling people from burning huts. No weapons, no uniforms, just hands reaching out. Beneath a loose floorboard near the teacher's desk, they found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, some written in English, others in French, Arabic, and local dialects. The handwriting was careful, sometimes shaky, as if written by many different hands over many years. One journal began, "They called us ghosts because we don't speak, but we remember every name we lost." Another entry dated just a few months ago read, "Today a convoy came too close. We watched them sleep. One man cried in his dreams. We took his rifle to show we could. Then we cleaned it and gave it back. Maybe he'll think twice before pointing it at a child." Page after page told the same story, not of revenge, but of protection. These were former child soldiers, yes, but also teachers, farmers, medics, people who'd been dragged into war as kids and somehow clawed their way back to humanity. They'd formed a silent pact. No more killing. Only shielding. Only warning. They sabotaged supply lines not to hurt but to delay. They mimicked voices not to deceive but to remind outsiders of what they'd left behind. Their own families, their own humanity. They moved like shadows because they'd learned that being unseen was the only way to stay alive long enough to protect others. One entry struck the team leader harder than the rest. "We are not monsters. We are what happens when war forgets you, but we remember the children. So we stay." He sat back on his heels, the journal open in his hands. All this time they'd been afraid of ghosts. But the real horror wasn't in the silence, it was in what created it. These people hadn't chosen to become invisible. The world had made them that way. And still they chose to guard the helpless instead of lashing out. Outside, a soft sound made them freeze. Not a footstep, but the rustle of cloth. They turned slowly. In the doorway stood a figure, thin, barefoot, wearing patched clothes, no weapon, just eyes, deep, calm, and watching. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the figure raised one hand, palm open, not in threat, but in gesture. "Come, see." They followed, hearts pounding but weapons holstered. Through the village, past empty homes, to a hidden cellar beneath a collapsed hut. Inside, candles flickered over shelves lined with medicine, clean bandages, baby formula, and sacks of grain. A small radio played softly, news from the capital, not static, not whispers. And in one corner, a stack of children's drawings, stick figures holding hands, sons with smiling faces, houses with smoke curling from chimneys. This wasn't a hideout for killers. It was a sanctuary. The figure, now joined by two others equally quiet, motioned to a map pinned to the wall. It showed the region, with red X's marking where armed groups had attacked villages. Green circles marked safe zones they'd protected. And one road, the very one the team had been hired to secure, was marked with a question mark and a single word. Why? The team leader understood. Their convoy wasn't just delivering aid. Someone powerful wanted that road open, for mining, for control, for profit. And innocent villages stood in the way. The still ones weren't targeting them out of fear. They were testing them, seeing if they were just another tool of destruction, or if they could still choose differently. One of the silent figures handed him a small wooden carving, a child holding a bird. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. This is what we guard. As they walked back to camp that evening, the weight in the team leader's chest wasn't fear anymore. It was shame. They'd come in with guns and assumptions ready to treat this land like a battlefield. But the real battle here wasn't for territory, it was for dignity, for the right to live without being erased. That night, around a low fire, he told his team everything. No exaggeration, no drama, just truth. And for the first time, they didn't argue. They didn't plan a countermove. They just sat in silence, staring into the flames, thinking about the faces in those drawings, the words in those journals, the open palm in the doorway. They hadn't been hunted. They'd been given a chance. And now, they had to decide what kind of humans they wanted to be. The decision came quietly, without fanfare or debate. The team leader called headquarters the next morning, his voice steady but firm. Mission compromised, he said. Environmental hazards. Unstable ground. Recommend immediate withdrawal. He didn't mention ghosts or silent watchers or journals hidden under floorboards. He gave them the kind of reason that wouldn't raise eyebrows, just enough truth wrapped in bureaucracy to make it stick. Within hours, the convoy turned around. No shots fired. No confrontation. Just engines roaring to life and dust rising behind them as they rolled out of the region for good. The client would be angry. Money would be lost. But for the first time in years, the team didn't care about the paycheck. They cared about what they'd seen, and what they hadn't done. Back in Nairobi, far from the dry winds and silent villages, life tried to return to normal. Gear was cleaned, reports were filed, debriefings held. But something had shifted. The jokes were quieter, the silences longer. One by one, each member of the team began to carry the weight of what they'd learned, not as a secret, but as a responsibility. The team leader didn't go back to taking just any job that paid well. He started asking questions he'd never asked before. Who's really behind this contract? Who benefits if this village is cleared out? What happens to the people after we leave? He even reached out, carefully through trusted channels, to a small international group that documented human rights violations in conflict zones. He sent them a heavily edited version of what he'd seen, satellite coordinates, descriptions of the safe zones, evidence of nonviolent resistance. Enough to protect, not expose. He made sure Zone Theta stayed off every future map used by private security firms. Months passed. Then one rainy afternoon, he received a grainy satellite image from a contact. It showed the same cluster of villages he'd once feared. Only now there were new roofs. A well had been dug in the center of the main square. Children played near a rebuilt schoolhouse. No armed presence. No checkpoints. Just life returning, slowly, carefully, like green shoots after a long drought. He printed the image and pinned it to his wall, not as a trophy but as a reminder. Others on the team changed too. One started volunteering with an organization that helped former child soldiers rebuild their lives, not with weapons, but with farming tools, education, counseling. Another quietly donated half of every contract fee to a medical fund working in remote parts of West Africa. They never spoke publicly about what happened. No interviews. No social media posts. But if someone asked why they refused certain jobs now, they'd just say, "I've seen enough." The fear didn't vanish overnight. Sometimes, in the dark, one of them would still wake up thinking they heard a whisper or saw a shadow move too smoothly. But the fear had changed. It wasn't about being hunted anymore. It was about failing to see the humanity in others, about becoming the kind of person who walks into someone else's home with guns and assumptions, never asking who lives there or what they've survived. Years later, the team leader kept a small wooden carving on his desk, a child holding a bird, just like the one given to him in that hidden cellar. Visitors would ask about it. He'd just smile faintly and say, "It's a reminder that sometimes the quietest people are the ones protecting the most." He never returned to that part of the world, but he never forgot it either. And in his private journal, the last entry about the mission read simply, "We called them monsters because they didn't fight like us. But maybe the real monsters are the ones who pay us to forget they're human." The legend of the Still Ones faded from mercenary circles. New crews came and went, chasing contracts and adrenaline. Some heard rumors, stories of convoys that turned back for no reason, of weapons found cleaned and returned, of villages that somehow stayed safe despite the chaos around them. Most dismissed it as myth, superstition. Just another ghost story told around campfires, but a few, the ones who'd been there, or who'd listened closely, knew better. They knew the truth wasn't in the silence, but in the choice behind it. The choice to protect instead of destroy, to warn instead of kill, to remain unseen so others could be seen. And so when new contracts came in for that region, those few would quietly decline. Not because they were afraid, but because they finally understood. Some places aren't meant to be conquered. They're meant to be respected. The world kept turning. Wars flared and faded. Companies rose and fell. But in a quiet corner of northeastern Nigeria, children went to school. Wells gave clean water. And in the evenings, if you stood very still and listened past the wind, you might hear nothing at all, just the sound of peace, carefully guarded by those the world had tried to erase. And that, more than any battle or victory, was the real story. Not of fear, but of quiet courage. Not of monsters, but of humans who refused to stop being human, even when the world gave them every reason to.